Wednesday, February 26th, 2020. You're listening to episode number 5 of the Don't Know Jack show. I am your host, Don't Know Jack. So last week, I want to apologize. I was not prepared for that show last week, and I got some feedback actually on it telling me how dull it was. And I'm going to do better this week. I do have some articles, but I'm not going to just, read them. I'm going to paraphrase them, and we're going to talk about them. And especially today's article, because in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the George Washington farewell address. He penned that on September 17th, 1796, and it was published 2 days later in David Claypole's American Daily Advertiser. So we're going to be talking about that, and it's a long address, but I found some paragraphs in it and that I want to talk about that relate a lot to what's going on today in our country. So I want to talk about that. We're also going to talk about the coronavirus update in today's episode. We're going to talk about the Born Alive bill, which was a bill that would give doctors the ability to work on a baby after being born, to help it, to give a baby medical treatment after they're born. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the latest Project Veritas video that exposes senior executive at ABC, pretty much talking about how the truth is not in their best interest to tell. And I thought that's pretty interesting. And then we're going to, a few weeks ago, I was going to show a Q post. I don't know if any of you follow Q or not. A lot of people say it's a conspiracy theory or a cult or whatever. It's interesting. It's the only cult I've ever seen that encourages people to think for themselves. So we're going to talk about one post that I saw a few weeks ago that relates pretty much to the newest Project Veritas video. So we're going to talk about that as well. But so let's get right into it. Let's take a look at this farewell address by George Washington. First, I'm going to show you the mountvernon.org website, where they have the source document of the farewell address. And as you can see, it is quite long. The source document and the transcript is quite long. But that's okay, because what I did was I found some paragraphs in the document, in the address, that I wanted to go over. And I think that, like I was saying, I think a lot of what he was saying in his farewell address applies to today. Let's remember that there were no term limits. He was loved in the country at that time and could have went on to serve more terms, but he decided to step down because he wanted to set a precedent of term limits. So he not only stepped down, but he gave this farewell address to the country as a way to kind of remind people what they fought for and what liberty was all about and the importance of liberty. So one of the paragraphs that I took out was, "The name of American which belongs to you in your national capacity must always exalt the just pride of patriotism, more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles." Now, when he says the same religion, let's remember that there were many religions in the country at the time. So the same religion he means more, you have the same religion as those that have the same religion as you within the boundaries of this country, or borders of this country. So I think that's important, that he was talking about just always, remember about the patriotism and the pride of it, and that we have slight shades of difference, I think it's important to remember kind of that there were many schools of thought at the time. I know a lot of people today will like to say that everybody was racist in the country at that time, and all the founders were racist, and let's not, I'm not going to mince words. George Washington had slaves. I think he had over 200 slaves, actually. It said that the teeth in his mouth were wood, and and it was I think it was said that he was I'm gonna say he was brutal, but I know his slaves had to work hard in order to maintain Mount Vernon. Let's put it that way. So, but I will say this: there were many schools of thought, and there was a bigger than the love of slavery and the desire to be racist. What I'm gathering is this desire for liberty and freedom that existed because they were trying to escape tyranny and oppression from the British. So this feeling was innate to them, if that makes sense. So anyway, let's go on. Another paragraph I thought was interesting I took out. It says, while then every part of our country thus feels an immediate and particular interest in union, all the parts combined cannot fail to find the united mass of means and efforts greater strength, greater resource, proportionably greater security from external danger, a less frequent interruption of their peace by foreign nations, and what is inestimable value. They must derive from union an exemption from those broils of war between themselves which so frequently afflict neighboring countries, not tied together by the same governments, which their own rivalships alone would be sufficient to produce, but which opposite foreign alliances, attachments, and intrigues would stimulate and embitter. Hence, likewise, they will avoid the necessity of those overgrown military establishments which under any form of government are inauspicious to liberty, and which are to be regarded as particularly hostile to republican liberty. In this sense, it is that your union ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty, and that the love of the one ought to endear to you the preservation of the other. So, what I gathered from this was that the union, and not to be so much deterred by any type of foreign nation, but to have loyalty to the union and liberty, right? So your love of the union is going to ensure that you want to maintain liberty, and your love of liberty is going to maintain the union. So that's what I got from that. It says, we are authorized to hope that a proper organization of the whole, with the auxiliary agency of government for the respective subdivisions, will afford a happy issue of the experiment. It is well worth a fair and full experiment, with such powerful and obvious motives to union, affecting all parts of our country. While experience shall not have demonstrated its impracticability, there will always be reason to distrust the patriotism of those who in any quarter may endeavor to weaken its bands. This, I thought was interesting because I took this part out because he emphasized experiment, you know, and he was saying that it's worth the experiment to try this union, and to focus on liberty. Um, so I thought that was interesting because it's something that we're still trying to master. We were an imperfect union then, and we're still trying to master it and get it right. But I think a lot of people hold on to some of the negatives in the founding of the country. The 3/5, a human for African Americans, for example, I think is a stain on this country's history. And I honestly believe if that wasn't done, that we'd have a different country, because how can you have all men are created equal, but at the same time have certain men are only 3/5 of man? So it's a contradiction in itself. But I do understand at the time there were a lot of people against the 3/5. They had to make a compromise. It was called a 3/5 compromise for a reason. And let's not forget that the slave states and the heavy agriculture producing states had a lot of power at that time. So I'm not saying it's right, but I got to look at the entire picture to try to understand what was going on at that time and why a compromise even had to be made and why such contradictions. Because actually, when you looked at Thomas Jefferson's original notes, there was no 3/5 compromise. He knew that everybody had to be equal after the revolution. So, that they knew it didn't make sense. A lot of people knew it didn't make sense at the time. But you're fighting with power. You're fighting with greed. You're fighting with people with a lot of money and power in the country. So it was made. Compromise was made, unfortunately, but it was done. One method of assault may be to effect in the forms of the Constitution alterations which will impair the energy of the system, and thus to undermine what cannot be directly overthrown. So, I said one way that people might try to assault our union or affect it, which will be to alter it. You know what I mean? And they'll alter it in a way to impair the energy of the system and thus undermine what can't be directly overthrown. So, you can't just go in and just, because the Constitution is made with the checks and balances, so they just can't go in and just take it out, just that easily. But you can alter it. You can alter things in a way which will impair the energy. So then it says, in all the changes to which you may be invited, remember that time and habit are at least as necessary to fix the true character of governments as of other human institutions. That experience is the surest standard by which to test the real tendency of the existing constitution of a country. I like that because it was pretty much saying time and habit, experience. That we have history to look at. We have time. We've seen the habits of people. We've been able to see the tendencies of or what things lead to in the future, and so it's a good way of gauging what's happening in the country and what's going to happen based on what has happened. So I thought that was good. It's something to always remind ourselves that we have to look at, the history and understand why and ask the question. I think a lot of times people get too caught up in, they get too emotional about things. And like slavery, for example, I think it's a very emotional subject, a very touchy subject, especially for African Americans and even non-African Americans that maybe feel a guilt trip or a desire to be emotional about it. On the other sense of feeling guilty about it, maybe not that their ancestors were slaves, but they may feel that they had some role in slavery. Maybe their ancestors were slave masters or owned slaves, or maybe they believe their ancestors did and they probably didn't, but that's another story. So anyway, then it goes on to say, mere hypotheses of opinion. Exposes to perpetual change from the endless and variety of hypotheses and opinion, and remember especially that for the efficient management of our common interests in a country so extensive as ours, a government of as much vigor as is consistent with the perfect security of liberty is indispensable. Liberty itself will find in such a government with powers properly distributed and adjusted its surest guardian. It is indeed little else than a name where the government is too feeble to withstand the enterprises of faction, to confine each member of the society within the limits prescribed by the laws, and to maintain all the secure and tranquil enjoyment of the rights of person and property. All right. It is important likewise that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution. I like that. Like we were saying earlier, like looking at the past and looking at why and the motives and the motivations of men. We should look at those, and it should inspire caution in us. We shouldn't be so zealous in our actions. Caution in those entrusted with its administration to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon another. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments in one, and thus to create, whatever the form of government, a real despotism. A just estimate of that love of power and proneness to abuse it, which predominates in the human heart, is sufficient to satisfy us of the truth of this position. Yeah. It's we cannot forget that we are human and that we have our own interests, and will seek power in some type of way, and there will be those who will abuse it. It is natural, and it's something that we can't forget. So when we see a consolidation of power, one of the first things I think about is socialism, for example. I think about socialism and this desire to consolidate power in the name of more security or supposed freedom. I think of that when I'm reading this in George Washington's farewell address, and it's just a constant reminder, and we can never, in my opinion, at least I can never forget that there are self-interests of human beings. So it's not an institution. It's interesting when you hear like free education or free healthcare. You hear the word free, but you don't hear or see the ones behind the curtain. The men and women who have their own self-interests and who will abuse the powers that they have vested in them to further their self-interest. So, it's just something that at least I always remember. I'm always thinking about that. No matter how good something sounds, as far as an organization or a bureaucracy, that there are human beings behind the curtain. So I will never forget that. Of all the dispositions and habit which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. I like that one because, the religion, people's faith is something higher than the human. It's higher. It's a higher power, and your morality is pretty much goes hand in hand with your religion or your faith. So that's indispensable support, that has to go with habits. And let us with caution indulge with supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. And it says with caution now. let's emphasize that, with caution. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. And I like how he ended it with religious principle, and not necessarily religion. And also with caution, indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. So he kind of leaves it open where, because this is, freedom of religion in this country, you can't forget that, so, but he did put an emphasis on have caution that morality can be maintained without religion. And then at the end, he says that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. Forbid us to expect that. So I think that's important, just, you'll always hear people in today say, separation of church and state. Yeah, the church is not religious principle. It's not, the higher power is not the church. The church is an institution maintained by who? Human beings, just like we were talking about earlier. So let's not get the two mixed up, church and state, and kind of remember what this country was founded on. And, and the belief in inalienable rights coming from God, not government. So anyway, the nation, prompted by ill will and resentment, sometimes impels to war the government, contrary to the best calculations of policy. The government sometimes participates in the national propensity and adopts through passion what reason would reject. At other times, it makes the animosity of the nation subservient to projects of hostility instigated by pride, ambition, and other sinister and pernicious motives. The peace, often, sometimes perhaps the liberty of nations has been the victim. Now in this, he was talking about foreign nations, and he was saying that if it's prompted by ill will and resentment, it can sometimes impel war. For example, how you'll constantly hear this animosity towards Russia, for example. Now, in my opinion, it's used for political purposes. It's used to try to paint a certain picture when it comes to Russia's relation with certain individuals in this country or certain institutions, and it's used to paint a negative picture. So it's used politically, And they're saying that if it's prompted by ill will and resentment, it can sometimes impel the war, to war that government, contrary to the best calculations of policy. Okay? And then, and adopts through passion. It makes the animosity of the nation subservient to projects of hostility. Yes. What? Okay. And it says, hold on. There was something I was trying to get. Maybe it's in this next one. Hold on. And it gives to ambitious, corrupted, or deluded citizens who devote themselves to the favorite nation. Okay, here it is. Facility to betray or sacrifice the interests of their own country without odium, sometimes even with popularity, gilding, with the appearances of a virtuous sense of obligation, a commendable deference for public opinion, or a laudable zeal for public good, the base or foolish compliances of ambition, corruption, and infatuation. Now, when I think of this, for example, I was thinking about what we do with our neighbors to the south, for example, bringing in illegal immigrants, and how it's not we're sacrificing the interests of the nation. You know, that some people are doing for what they feel is public good or public, you know, and it might be deference to public opinion, like they were saying, but it's not good. It's not good, you know. So in other words, George Washington was saying, don't have favorite nations and don't have nations that you hate. And he goes on further in this. I guess that's all I copied, but you know, he talks about the kind of relationship that we should have with foreign nations as far as it should be commercial, but we shouldn't be involved in the politics of other nations. We shouldn't be trying to change their politics. As a matter of fact, in the same farewell address, he discusses a jealousy for liberty that you want people to have. You want people to be jealous of freedom, right? That's what you really want. So in other words, you want to lead by example, that our liberty is so important to us, and that we not only want to be jealous of each other of liberty when it comes to states or whatever, or you know, under the 10th Amendment, certain, you know, states can have different laws. We want to be jealous of each other, but you also want foreign nations to be jealous of our liberty as well. So anyway, I would strongly recommend reading George Washington's farewell address. It's his farewell address to the nation, and you know, despite what you think of, whatever prejudices you might have of George Washington, I know he was a slave owner, like I was talking about earlier, but just to get a better understanding, let's not forget, the founders of this country felt that they were oppressed themselves. Okay, they felt they were. So if you feel that, oh, those white men or whatever, you know, and they were slave owners and all this kind of stuff, well, let's not forget that they wanted to separate from Britain, and they wrote a constitution in order to protect themselves, from other white men. You know, there were still people loyal to the British in this country, loyal to the crown. They still exist today, as a matter of fact. And so they were trying, the thought process, understand that thought process. I think it's pretty profound. They were trying to protect themselves from themselves. They knew how evil they could be, and they knew the power of parties and the power of you know, kind of you know, corruption, and how self-interest would lead to corruption and abuse of power. So they knew about all these things. They've seen they saw what they were capable of. So you know, just leave you know, if you could possibly leave the race thing out of it, even though I know it's difficult because it's such a major part of the Constitution. But if you can get past that by any chance, you can definitely see a strong desire for freedom and liberty, and how to attain it, or how to keep it at least. So I think it's pretty good. It's a good read. Like I said, The site, if you want to read it for yourself, is mountvernon.org, www.mountvernon.org, and it's Washington's farewell address, 1796. So we're gonna take a break. Talking about George Washington. We're gonna take a break, and we get back from the break, we're gonna talk about the coronavirus, how it's spreading. Just had a new case in Brazil today. Apparently, it was a traveler who had visited northern Italy, and apparently the case spread in northern Italy from travelers from China. So I don't know. This thing is spreading all over. So when we get back from the break, we're going to talk about the coronavirus and look at some maps and look at some information from the CDC, and catch you on the other side. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain how it works. Best of all, it's free. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Welcome back to the Don't Know Jack show. We got this coronavirus. And interesting story, I went to the, hospital weeks ago to get tested for coronavirus, and I had found out that they didn't really have the facilities, or the resources, I'm saying, to test for coronavirus. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And, they kept asking me questions about, did I come from China? So, anyway, I think it's important that we look at a map. So let's just go ahead and take a look. Let's take a look at the live map of coronavirus. The coronavirus disease 19, which is abbreviated COVID-19. And these are the global cases by the Johns Hopkins University. These are live, updated cases. As you can see, we just got one in South America and Brazil. I think that was today. We got cases in North America. Expand this here. Got a couple in North Africa. Heavy over in Asia. Man, heavy over there. And yeah, pretty much all over the world. A couple in Australia. So I would say the only place I was gonna say the only place safe is like sub-Saharan Africa, but I don't think any place is good. Maybe Greenland. You might be safe in Greenland. So, but I thought it was pretty interesting, because I'm looking at that. I'm looking at that, right? And then I'm looking at the CDC's website here. This page will open up. CDC's website. Come on. Give me a second here. All right, here we go. Now, this is the criteria for when to test or when to evaluate people for coronavirus, right? So then it says, if you got a fever or sign a symptom of lower respiratory illness, cough, or shortness of breath. Okay? Okay, that could be anybody. Then it says fever, cough, shortness of breath, and a history of travel to the Hubei province of China within the 14 days. And this is today. Like, this is on the CDC's website today, right? And it says fever, signs and symptoms of lower respiratory illness, cough, shortness of breath, requiring hospitalization, and you've been to mainland China within 14 days. The thing is, as I just showed you on that map, this is not in China. You know, I was sick. I don't know if you guys remember on the show, I was coughing like crazy a few weeks ago. I was sick. Went to the hospital, to the VA actually, yeah. And, you know, I had contact with the, I wouldn't say people from China, people from Asia, you know, coming from Japan, Korea. And I was telling them that in there, and they were like, oh, you know, we only got to worry about people from China. And I'm like, man. So anyway, there's only a limited places that you can test for coronavirus in the country, and it's at these CDC labs. Although they can take blood samples and send them to the labs, but I don't know how often they do that. So, you know, if this does become some type of pandemic, I'm no genius. You know, as my freaking nickname is Don't Know Jack, for crying out loud. But I would think this. It's the sixth season. They could be waiting for the flu to go away, though. I will give them that, because then you can cut down on. You can kind of limit who you're going to blood sample. But I'm thinking, sample as many people as possible, test as many people as possible, and reduce travel as much as possible. I know it sounds overwhelming, but then at least you can isolate it better. But yeah, I thought it was pretty interesting that they had, they're still talking about China as like that's the only thing you need to worry about. So I thought that was interesting. So anyway, be careful about the coronavirus. It's spreading all around the world, as I showed you on the map. How many cases was it again? I think it was like, and this is updated like, reload. These are live updates happening. So we are at 74,000. No, it just went up again. 78,497. Oh, that's just China. What's the worldwide? What is the world? Oh, total confirmed. 82,163 total. It's all around the world. 82,000. So it's growing. I remember when it was 100. So it's growing. So it's something to think about, that it's all over the world. It's all over the world. They're saying that people like 80 or up, or people that have some type of ailment already, like pneumonia, these are the high risk, people that need to worry about it. But hey, just don't believe that it's only China you need to worry about. And also, they were saying that, I was reading on the WHO website, World Health Organization website, that, if you are coughing or if you are sneezing, wear a mask. The mask isn't so much for the person who isn't coughing or who isn't sneezing. It's for the person that you see walking around, just putting their fist over their mouth. Meanwhile, they got their freaking saliva and breath coming out the sides of their fist. Those are the ones you need to worry about. I see people coughing and sneezing out in public, and I'm like, I just want to, I wish I had masks just to give them. Um, you know, but then I see the people just walking around fine with the mask on, and I'm like, man, these other people need to have the dang mask. So anyway, that's that. Keeping the discussion in the sphere of health, another story that interested me was the Born Alive bill, which failed in the Senate. I thought it was interesting because it's about abortions, and let's say the abortion fails, and the baby is born alive, that a doctor can give medical treatment to that baby. If the abortion failed and the baby's born alive, but there's some complications or whatever, it failed. So in other words, just let the baby just die. You can't even save its life. You just have to just hands off, let the baby die. I thought this was horrible, in my opinion. So let's take a look at an article and kind of see which senators voted and which way they voted on the bill. So this article is from National Review. It was published yesterday, actually. The vote, by a vote of 53 to 44, it failed to pass the Born Alive Abortion Survivor Protections Act. So it was sponsored by Ben Sass and co-sponsored by 49 of his fellow Republican senators. It needed 60 votes to overcome the legislative filibuster. And only 3 Democrats crossed the line to vote with Republicans in favor of the legislation, who were Bob Casey of Pennsylvania, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, and Doug Jones. So they needed 60. Okay, so all the Republicans voted in favor of it, the Born Alive bill, to protect these infants. 3 Democrats voted for it. And then all these Democrats that are currently running for president, be it Cory Booker, Sherrod Brown, Kirsten Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders, they voted against it. And then 3 Republican senators didn't vote on it at all: Kevin Cramer, Lisa Murkowski, and Tim Scott. Says Scott missed it to flight delays. So, I'm not gonna, would that 53 plus, they still wouldn't have got it anyway if they had made it, but it would have been nice for them to show their vote and be there. So, yeah, I just thought that was horrible. I thought this whole bill was horrible. If you get a chance, read up on this, on the Born Alive bill. And, yeah, I just think I think it sucks. I think if a baby is born, the abortion failed, and a baby's alive, you should be able to provide treatment and save the baby's life, and I don't see any use or how that helps anyone just letting a baby die. Or I'm not a big fan of abortion, period, to be honest with you. Not a big fan of it, but I think it would lead to better relationship choices, in my opinion. I'm not saying that all pregnancies are due to a relationship. I understand that there's rape and incest involved in some pregnancies, but for the most part, a lot of these abortions, if it were seen as murder, it would cause people to make better relationship choices, in my opinion, at least, if they knew that there was a consequence for their actions. it kind of leads to a kind of a debaucherous lifestyle when you can kill a baby so easily, with no consequence or regard for a human life. And I think it leads to an immoral society. So I'm not a big fan of abortion. Not my forte. So, yeah, but take a look at it. Now, this video is from the Project Veritas Twitter feed. It's 3 minutes long. We might not watch it all. Once you get past the beginning of it, the point is pretty much already made. But let's go ahead and watch it.
You consider yourself a Democrat socialist? Yeah.
I'd consider myself a socialist. Not terrible. I feel like it's like the truth suffers. The voters are poorly informed. Our bosses don't see an upside in doing the job that we're supposed to do, which is to speak truth to power and hold people to account. People in New York are absolutely, I think, fascinated by it. How can people like Donald Trump? How can people understand Trump? Cross the Hudson now and then and come out and spend some time, and you'll hear why. Colleague of mine on Kobe Bryant. He said that all of his daughters died in helicopter crashes. And that was it. He just fucked up. And got bad information and reported bad information. And has paid the price for it. He got suspended. But, the fake news amounts, like the problems with the truth. We don't hold him to account. We also don't give him credit for what things he does do. It became like a profit center, a promotion center. Like, you can't watch Good Morning America without there being a Disney princess or a Marvel Avenger appearing. It's all self-promotion. Right. And promotion of the company, and also promotion within the company. Commercial imperative is incompatible with sales. And I still think that we don't understand markets. I don't think we're terribly interested in markets. We're all guilty of the same thing. Yeah. I think that all these big news organizations, again, I'm speaking about broadcast television, ABC, CBS, NBC, and we recognize that we're dinosaurs and we're in danger of dying. We're not disciplined enough to cut them off, and we second guess ourselves because we're sensitive to the accusation that we're in the tank for the Democrats. And so like that enables them. And so we enable them. And then like it feels like every time we take the bait on the outrage, we enable them. He's the nightmare spouse that you can't win an argument with.
Yeah, why don't you like him?
All right. So we did watch the whole thing. So I don't know if you guys follow Q or not. I do. Some people say a conspiracy theory, whatever, or a cult, they call it. I find it interesting. There's a cult that actually encourages people to think for themselves. So anyway, there was a Q post a couple weeks ago, and I meant to talk about it on the podcast a couple weeks ago, but it was 38:59, and it was on the date February 12th, 2020, and it came in at 9:04 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So anyway, it starts with a poster, The Great Awakening. And then it goes on to say, what happens when 90% of the media is controlled, owned by 6 corporations? What happens when those same corporations are operated and controlled by a political ideology? What happens when the news is no longer free from bias? What happens when the news is no longer reliable and independent? What happens when the news is no longer trustworthy? What happens when the news simply becomes an extension arm of a political party? Fact becomes fiction? Fiction becomes fact? When does news become propaganda? Identity creation? How does the average person who is under constant financial stress by design find time to research and discern fact versus fiction? Majority of people more prone to believe someone in power sitting behind a big brand news name. Do people, human psyche, tend to follow the majority mainstream viewpoint in fear of being isolated or shunned? Mainstream is used for a reason. Dominate, trend, and opinion. If majority people believe X, then X must be validated or true. Why do mainstream media heads within different organizations always use the same keywords or catchphrases? Coordinated? By who? An outside entity providing instructions? Do they count on the fact that people, human psyche, are more prone to believe something if heard over and over again by different trusted sources? Do echo chamber tactics provide validation, credibility to the topic point being discussed? Threat to intellectual freedom? Would control over these institutions, organizations allow for the mass control of populations? Viewpoint regarding desired topic? Read again. Digest. Would control over these institutions, organizations allow for the mass control of a population's viewpoint regarding a desired topic? Logical thinking. Why, after the election of 2016, did Democrats and media corporations jumpstart a coordinated and planned divisive blitz intended to create falsehood regarding legitimacy of election, character assassination of POTUS through sexism, racism, every other ism, pre and post 2016 election? Why were violent, masked terror organizations such as Antifa immediately created and funded? Why were these organizations tasked with immediate intimidation, shutdown of any pro-POTUS rally and or events? Why were marches immediately organized to counter and silence pro-POTUS rallies and or events? Why were marches immediately organized which divided people into sex, gender, race, isms? When you control the levers of news dissemination, you control the narrative. Control of the narrative equals power. When you are blind, what do you see? They want you divided. Divided by religion, divided by sex, divided by political affiliation, divided by class. When you are divided and angry and controlled, you target those different from you, not those responsible, the controllers. Divided, you are weak. Divided, you pose no threat to their control. When non-dogmatic information becomes free and transparent, it becomes a threat to those who attempt to control the narrative and or stable. Livestock kept, sheep. When you are awake, you stand on the outside of the stable. Groupthink collective, which is the stable, and have free thought. Free thought is a philosophical viewpoint which holds that positions regarding truth should be formed on the basis of logic, reason, and empiricism, rather than authority, tradition, revelation, or dogma. This represents a clear and present danger to the constitutional republic of the United States of America. I'm not even going to go into it any further. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Think for yourself, and these news organizations, like the podcast started, human beings with self-interest, abusing their power to control your thought, control your thinking. ask questions. That's what this podcast is all about. Ask questions, and realize that you don't know jack, no matter if you're watching the news all day long. I kind of have that keep that belief that, you really don't know. Ask the question why. Even like George Washington was saying in his farewell address, look at history, look at the habits of people. Time will give you a lot of information. So, anyway, that's pretty much today's podcast. And, hopefully you tune in next Wednesday, for another show. And that's it. Don't Know Jack signing out. See you next week. Bye-bye.